Kia ora. Today we've got Tanith Wirihana Te Waitohioterangi with us. Tanith, can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Kia ora. Well, my name is Tanith Wirihana Te Waitohioterangi, and I'm just another humble student of political science and public policy at Victoria University of Wellington, Te Here Ngā Waka.
So you've been doing some serious research on the colonisation of Aotearoa. You explained that over in Tairāwhiti there was a prophecy about the arrival of Lieutenant James Cook in Aotearoa.
Yes. In our account of events, it was Te Toiro Ikariki who said, "Tifa tifa te pō, ko te pākere whā, ko ārikirangi tēnei rā te haere nei." It's a very interesting prophecy. The reason why we knew it was 3 years before was the fact that we were keeping track of the lunar months, and these things were still remembered long after the fact. So it was done in the month of Te Mātahi o Te Tau 3 years beforehand, and the prophecy itself is very interesting. Tifa tifa te pō, dark, dark is the night, or gloomily dark is the night. Ko te pākere whā, two meanings. One relates to pākeha, the things that come from the sea, the origin of the term Pākehā, and mate refa, influenza, the viruses that they brought, biological warfare, and arikirangi, the response against all of these things during the wars for sovereignty over our land and such, some years after the fact.
Can you tell us about that first day, Her Majesty's Bark Endeavour, and its arrival off the coast of Aotearoa?
Well, I will, but I'll go back a few days beforehand. I believe it was on the 6th when the Endeavour first sighted land. It was met by a shark. And, in Tūna, we have tales of our kaitiaki, tū more, a white pointer shark, which basically protects a lot of our different taonga ika and kāpata kai from Tūranga all the way down to Te Mahia. And, when I think about this, the fact that that very kaitiaki must have sensed the danger that was coming and went to go and investigate. Fast forward to the first day when Cook arrived, when he actually makes land. He comes to shore, sees several people with, I would assume to be whata, because they described them as like long pikes or spears. So obviously those people were bird spearing. The person who came forth was Te Maro. Now, 99 years later, there was words by a volunteer who fought at the Battle of Ngātapa. His name was J.P. Ward. And he basically said something along the lines of, "And we shot them like dogs beneath the meteor banner of mighty England." When we take this single quotation and we throw it back to that very first day, the first person who was shot was Te Maro. It was a portent warning of the times to come, the dark times. Now, on the second day, Te Maro's body was still laying there, and the rangatira of Rongowhakaata had gone over to investigate what was actually happening. So in the distance, Cook and the Endeavour crew were watching, observing, seeing what was happening at this crime scene as our rangatira were investigating. But like any criminal, they always return to the scene of the crime. So the very next moment, Cook ordered several boats to go over, and they landed on the shore and went over, and they started attempting to negotiate with the people across the other side. But unfortunately, that day too also ended in bloodshed.
So there's 2 days where they're coming ashore and they're killing people.
Yes, and the same thing with the third day, if I recall correctly, because there comes the time also when, Cook just begins abducting people. He abducted these 3 kids. He pulls up on the Endeavour alongside these waka, and he sees these people there, and he's wanting to establish friendly relations by abducting them, because for some reason that implies that they're friendly. It's the same thing, you know. He's told specifically by his superior officers, don't kill anybody. These are people who have never met you before. And they just come to the shore and they're like, hey, we want to be your friend. How would you like some small shot in your shoulder, you know, and stuff like that. It's absolutely horrific when you actually look at it like this. So these three children, their names were Hikirangi, Haurangi, and Marukawati. They were three children belonging to Rongo Whakaata. Hikirangi and Haurangi were the ancestors of Te Waka, of Hone Tiatia, and I can't remember the name right now. Timoti Tohi. There were two master carvers of Rongo Whakaata. Timoti Tohi carved this potoko manawa of Te Waka Pirahuka, who was also a master carver of ours. And their elder brother was a rangatira named Te Kaitoira. Their parent was Te Horoeterangi. Te Kaitoira and Te Horoeterangi are present within our house, Te Hauki Tūranga, as the Poutuorongo and the Poutaku of our whare. So they're very important ancestors to us, and we have a direct link to that particular event in which they came and started all of this carnage. Like I say, the seeds were sown at that time that would lay the premise for things to come, you know, the coming of the dark times far after.
What was the end result of the carnage that Lieutenant Cook had caused?
Well, it's very complex because I think when you think about it, it was simply 3 days in a 1,000-year history. A lot of the carnage was yet to come. This was just a foreshadowing of those times. The real times of trouble came in the 1850s, 60s, 70s period in Tūranga, when the government created policies in such a way as to dispossess us of our land and to expedite the transition of our land to Pākehā and to other colonizers, and to arrange for our deportation from our land, the removal from our land without trial, without rights to appeal, and being sent off to places where we would be excluded from the ability to participate in protest or conversations about these things. And then the third was the maintenance of intertribal rivalries from the distant past by bringing in other groups to settle on our land that had no connections to us in that particular time or were not friendly to us in order to seek revenge. The likes of, say, for example, in Rongo Whakaata and in Tūranga in general, they brought down Ngāti Porou and established them as a semi-permanent garrison immediately after the Battle of Wairinga Ahika. And, you know, basically, it's a method of adding insult to injury, because this resulted in many other things happening. For instance, the theft of our house, Te Hauki Tūranga, in 1867. It is said that when the government agents came down, they went into a pub. They didn't really care which Māori they asked, so long as they asked some Māori. And obviously a group of Māori living on a particular block of land as a garrison is as good as any. So they went over and they asked the Ngāti Porou garrison, hey, you know, can you sell us this house? We came and we asked you before and you said no. And they were like, yep. Everybody except one person said yes. That indicates that these were not our people. They weren't on our side. So they send their agent Biggs over. Biggs was the one who was killed by Te Korti. Biggs helps to disassemble the house and sticks it onto the boat. And all throughout this time period, the people are saying, kau e tāhai, kau e tāhai, kau e pakaru a tātou whare, you know, and they just keep on taking it anyway, loading it onto the ship. Now, the interesting thing here is that when we consider the history of Te Korti and what was happening at that time, you know, Biggs was responsible for getting Māori to panic sell their land to settlers and also to himself, you know. Basically, it's like, if you're not willing to sell to us, we'll take it under the New Zealand Settlements Act and you'll receive nothing. You know, we'll simply say you're rebels because we possess all of the power to enforce the law and who it's enforced upon and to decide whether or not you're guilty of the crime. At the same time, he also had a booming trade in alcohol, debt trapping, another method of getting the land. And at the same time, you also have him executing, without trial, without rights to appeal, rangatira of Ngāti Kaipo Rongo at the battles that happened in Te Tairāwhiti, Pākai, Romi and Hunga Hunga Toro. Pita Tamaturi was one. He was the protege of Raharuhi Rukupo, and the other was his child, Te Waka Rongo too. So to add insult to injury, not only do you have the theft of our hapu's land, the execution of high-ranking rangatira, the theft of our house. So when Te Kōti came back, Raharuhi Rukupo still wanted to maintain his neutrality in the politics of the situation. So he sent a rangatira named Paura Te Whakahoehoe, bearing a mere pounamu tāwatahi, and a woman who was married to Te Kōti named Moniko, who was the daughter of Te Waru Tamatia. She later married an ancestor of mine. So he sends these people down to Whareongo and what is known as a tifa, a proposal with an offering. And that offering was essentially a contract to get rid of Biggs for all of the evil that he was doing amongst our people at the time. So Te Kōti comes back, and later on he ends up attacking Matawhero. They call it the Matawhero massacre, but the whole thing is more complex than that when you're looking at the negative externalities and problems which are generated by these colonizers at the time. And this provided the premise for what would come next, and that was the Battle of Ngātapa and Makeretu. We have the Magna Carta, and the Magna Carta speaks specifically about, rights, the freedom from arbitrary detainment, arbitrary searching, rights to trials. We have the Bill of Rights where it talks about the actual establishment of the law under the Crown. And we have the Treaty of Waitangi, which talks about how these different rights are enacted. Quite often, Te Kōti is taken, in the context of the Waitangi Tribunal context as committing acts on behalf of Māori, when in fact many of these things are hapu related. His own personal issues for being sent away, without trial, without rights to appeal, once again, to the Chathams. And essentially, there was no law that enabled them to do that. I remember reading through some notes that were written by Biggs, and he's saying, oh, hey, our whole plan is to get rid of the Māori. I talked to Stafford about it, who was the Premier at the time, and, he agrees that no real progress will be made unless we do this. You see? So what actually happens next? After trying to get rid of these people by sending them away, the Battle of Ngātapa happens. Immediately before we have the Battle of Makeretu, they take one of the people who was responsible for killing Biggs. His name was Nama, and they actually say to him, your God has abandoned you. Now Satan has you. And before you were introduced to the fires of the next world, we will introduce you to the fires of this. And they drag him, through the fires until he was dead. Battle of Ngātapa gets worse because you have all of these high-ranking colonial agents, colonial officers, and colonial politicians who are there. They didn't really care very much at the time about, whether they were doing justice on behalf of the people and victims of Matawhero. They were only there for one thing, to create an example. So you have many people who talk about, how this happens. They say that Rōpata Waha Waha, he had justifiable rights for utu, because he was a slave by Rongo Whakaata at one stage. But the thing is that he is operating under the law. That's the whole thing here, the law. And what he does next on behalf and with sanction from the Crown's officers, because Rōpata is getting paid the King's shilling. He is getting paid as a Crown agent and therefore is subject to the Crown's law. So acting as an extension of the Crown's authority, he has 130 people stripped naked, marches them up to the side of a cliff, and no different to the Nazis in Poland in the 1930s, has them shot off the side of the cliff, and their bodies falling on the ground until they rotted. J.P. Ward said that their bones are left in the summer sun to this day. And at the time, I believe it was £5 they were charging for a head. So after these bodies were at the bottom of this cliff just lying there, they started to chop all of their heads off. In fact, they believe that 2 or 3 of them were found during something in the 1980s when these 3 heads were brought up from the Turanga River and actually had like bullet holes in the back of them. And when they were examined at the time, they meet that. So no doubt they were some of those of the victims from that battle in Ngātapa.
Kia ora, thanks for that, Tanith. That was intriguing. Thanks for joining us today on Southern Cross News. Kia ora.